Welcome some of you just to lunch, and welcome to many of you after a wonderful morning of panels and a keynote at the Nixon Forum on U.S.-China Relations, which the Wilson Center is very, very proud to co-host. I'm Jane Harmon, Director and CEO of the Wilson Center, and while you're enjoying lunch, keep eating. There are sweets in the middle of the table. We'll keep supplying the brain food. Our discussion of U.S.-China relations now kicks into higher gear with remarks by the junior senator from Delaware who should come and sit. Chris, why don't you sit in the middle? I love instructing senators. By the junior senator from Delaware. Chris Coons has been outspoken on China as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and co-founder of the Senate Human Rights Caucus. A second-term senator, he's also vice chair of the Senate Ethics Committee and sits on the Appropriations and Judiciary Committees. We love the Appropriations Committee at the Wilson Center. Hint, hint, hint. Thank you for our increase. When Nixon made his historic trip to China in 1972, we checked this out, Chris was 9. But he was old enough, and I'm sure he was doing this, to be following the news coverage, and he has surely done his homework since. Appropriately enough, Senator Coons' lunch address is sandwiched, pun, between our last panel on the trade war and our next panel on human rights and religious freedom, issues close to his heart, and I know the hearts of everybody here. Chris, you and I last spoke about China in Aspen in early August, following your trip to China earlier this year, and earlier this month, as you know, the United States blacklisted 28 China tech companies and organizations for their role in enabling human rights violations against the Uyghurs. This was announced just days before Chinese Vice Premier Liu He visited Washington for the latest round of trade talks. The talks made progress on what President Trump called phase 1 of a longer-term trade deal, but as Wynn Lord told me, there's no evidence of what this deal actually says yet, and stay tuned. Maybe we will see some, just hoping that we will. So, next page is here. Meanwhile, after 130 days of protests, the unrest in Hong Kong has not waned despite the withdrawal of a bill that sparked the protests. The bill would have allowed citizens to be, that was withdrawn, would have allowed citizens to be extradited and tried in Chinese courts. The protesters' anger is now focused on violent police tactics. And no one missed the import of Chinese President Xi's warning last week in Nepal that anyone who attempts to split any region from China will have, quote, their bodies smashed and bones ground to powder. Obviously, this is a complex situation, and in the spirit of Richard Nixon, Hugh Hewitt is about to join me as we ask you questions following your remarks. In the spirit of Nixon, having a relationship with China matters to all of us, despite the bumps. And this effort today, and I know the efforts you make in the Senate, are geared to trying to manage the relationship and manage the bumps. And it is a very good thing, I will say this about you, sir, who is slightly late because there were votes in the Senate today and, at noon. No comment, no comment. I will restrain myself. It is a very good thing that you serve in the Senate and that you are serious about the international and complex issues we face. And so please welcome Senator Chris Coons for some opening remarks, and then Hugh and I will pose questions.
Forgive me. Thank you for the introduction as I struggle a little bit with logistics for a second. We have a duct-taped microphone, so hopefully that will work. Great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you to everybody here at the Wilson Center. Thanks for your forbearance, given that I was engaging in that all too rare but still structurally important activity of voting in the United States Senate. And to Hugh, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I look forward to what I know will be searching, challenging, and well-informed questions. And to those of you visiting from the Nixon Library and Foundation in California, I'm pleased you've chosen to focus on in this conference on not just the very important current set of issues in our bilateral relationship, but the history of how our countries got to this point and the willingness of leaders from both the United States and the People's Republic of China to think boldly and think creatively about ways to advance the shared interests of our countries. What kind of world will we inhabit together in the future? What rules will govern global conduct? How will we manage a rapidly changing climate, nuclear proliferation, the spread of deadly pandemics, the technologies that will shape our emerging future? These are the questions that the United States and China, as the world's largest economies with the most international influence and power, must answer. We share an interest in working together to address these vital and pressing questions. I favor a relationship with China in which we strive to cooperate as much as we compete in our efforts to set the rules that will govern international affairs. The reality, of course, is that there will be times when our views, our values, and our interests are at odds. And those moments will require us to have frank exchanges and more diplomatic engagement, not less, as Robert Daly has suggested in his work here at the Wilson Center. It will be vital, critical, for leaders of both countries to define and articulate our interests and priorities precisely and dispassionately. Inevitably, there will be areas in which we can and should compete. And today, I want to take a few minutes and outline what I believe a sustained and bipartisan American strategy for dealing with China looks like. The goal of this strategy is fairly simple, that the United States should retake its position as the leader of free and open societies around the world while making the necessary investments to secure our competitive edge. We must strive to coexist, compete, and cooperate with China, and all three are possible. This strategy requires meaningful engagement from every aspect of American society, from government to our private sector, Silicon Valley, to academia, think tanks, and other critical institutions. So let me start by making a few overarching points, if I could, that inform my views. First, recent talk of a renewed Cold War, a Cold War with China, is both inaccurate at best and self-fulfilling or even dangerous at worst. Over the last 40 years, the United States and China have benefited enormously from the establishment of strong ties and deep economic interaction with each other. Hundreds of millions of Chinese have raised themselves out of poverty through determined hard work after Deng Xiaoping embraced market forces. And as a result, China has become a peer competitor of the United States. It is time to stop talking about the rise of China and recognize China is a peer competitor today. Nonetheless, China's decision to neither open up politically nor economically since its succession to the WTO in 2001 has forced us to a point where we now must re-examine, recalibrate, and adjust the parameters of our relationship. President Trump's tariff war and Vice President Pence's October 2018 speech at the Hudson Institute have certainly gotten the attention of China's leadership and principally President Xi Jinping. And while I want to see the trade war end, as do millions of American farmers and manufacturers and business owners, there is bipartisan consensus that it should not end until we have rebalanced our trade relationship to allow countries to compete on a level playing field globally. As I've traveled across the United States, I've been to 10 cities in the last 2 weeks. There is a broad anger in our country, rooted in the perception that China has literally stolen the future of our middle class. That is a broadly shared consensus across many states and many contexts. Thus, if there is a mistaken belief that a Democrat winning the White House in 2020 would fundamentally change what are the dynamics between the United States and China in terms of discriminatory economic practices, I think they will not change. And I think, frankly, this is going to be a consistent pressure and challenge from American domestic politics going forward. We also must make it clear as a nation and a people that we are not opposed to China's success, that we have a deep respect for China's ancient culture and many accomplishments, and that the United States seeks to partner with China on many of the critical challenges that cross transnational borders. But at the same time, we cannot be naive. The United States must be vigilant about China's assertiveness abroad and recognize that if we want to preserve the openness that is so central, so beneficial to our country and our place in the world over the last 7 decades, we need to clarify our interest to Chinese officials, work with our allies and partners to present a united message to China, and commit ourselves to domestic democratic renewal. As former U.S. officials like Tom Donilon or Richard Haass have pointed out, in the case of competing with China, our foreign policy must begin at home. In Congress, this means working in good faith with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to reinvest in our communities and live up to and demonstrate the capacity, the potential of our democratic values to solve the real problems facing American families and America's economy. I want to offer up 4 specific ways in which the United States must play a leading role in working with its like-minded partners to preserve freedom and openness. These domains of competition are our seas and oceans, the industries of the future, the shape of the global economy, and the values systems of our societies. I'll also lay out a series of actions we can take now within the U.S. domestic context in each of these arenas to lay a better and stronger foundation for the future. First, we must make clear we intend to preserve open sea lanes and freedom of navigation around the world. China, like us, has an interest in keeping the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Malacca, other key maritime lanes open. Yet Chinese island building in the South China Sea, the coercive activity of its maritime militia, the opening of its first overseas military base in Djibouti, all run the risk of constraining international shipping, the free flow of trade, and U.S. military operations. U.S. leaders must work to bring their Chinese counterparts to the negotiating table to establish an agreed-upon maritime code of conduct and maritime deterrence. The Chinese should know which of their actions we oppose and our willingness to respond to preserve open sea lanes. We should work with regional partners to improve maritime domain awareness, conduct regular freedom of navigation exercises, and maintain our military presence in the region. Finally, the Senate should at long last ratify the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to bolster our ability to resolve maritime disputes peacefully and enshrine freedom of navigation as an international norm. During the summer of 2012, when I was a newly installed senator serving on foreign relations, I watched in amazement as literally dozens of credible, serious, diplomatic, military, and business leaders testified over a long series of hearings about the urgency of this matter, this treaty first advanced by the Reagan administration, yet they were ignored by a minority in the other party who claimed that ratification would harm our sovereignty. I think the consequences have been significant and harmful, and we have not been able to approach the developments in the South China Sea from a position of strength as a result. There are also steps we can take to improve our ability to safeguard the seas by adjusting our defense budget. Our military doesn't necessarily need to be any larger, but it does have to become more modern. As Chris Brose has written in Foreign Affairs, a revolution in military affairs is occurring today as artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, ubiquitous sensors, advanced manufacturing, quantum science, and other emerging technologies transform warfare and warfighting platforms and systems in ways we haven't seen in living memory. We should reprioritize our defense spending accordingly. Brose writes, and I quote, "A military made up of small numbers of very large, very expensive, heavily manned, hard-to-replace systems will not survive on battlefields. Success will require a different kind of military, one built around large numbers of small, inexpensive, expendable, highly autonomous systems," quote. We look at our annual budget, which is now around $750 billion, and feel safer by rank orderings that say we spend more on defense than the next 10 nations combined. But we are not spending it as effectively as we should be, as we must be. Spending $15 billion on an aircraft carrier that is vulnerable to a $10 million anti-ship missile is simply unwise. We should innovate and invest in new technologies that can swarm, dominate, and overwhelm adversaries and thus deter conflict. The United States has an unquestionable and sustained interest in ensuring open seas. Where China acknowledges this shared interest, we can work in partnership with them. But where they do not, we must work with allies and partners, enshrine international norms through UNCLOS, and alter our military spending. This leads me to the next and arguably the most important area in which the United States and China are already competing, the rules governing emerging technologies such as 5G, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, quantum computing, biotechnology, and the Internet of Things. Unlike the world of 30 years ago, each of these new technologies has a national security application, and the technical and ethical standards of conduct in fields like cyber, outer space, internet, and in particular Internet of Things have yet to be written and embraced. America's dominant position in technology and innovation has given us significant advantages in setting the stage for open and interoperable systems that underpin the concepts of innovation, freedom, and creative development. If that advantage instead slides and then shifts to an autocratic actor who is designing and setting rules in different ways in these core areas, our ability to set the terms of interactions for everything from business dealings to social and political discourse based on ethical, inclusive, and fair standards is foundationally at risk. Technology is a tool of national power China is wielding to achieve its aims. The U.S. government and our tech industry should view this as a generational call to action. That's why I'm so determined to help shape our country's approach toward China going forward, and this issue is increasingly the focus of my legislative work on revitalizing U.S. manufacturing, protecting patent holders and patent essential standards in 5G and other emerging sectors, and supporting new technologies in my home state of Delaware and across the country. The most important thing we can do to respond to China's rise is to strengthen our own capacity for innovation. We must reinvest in federally funded research and development, in STEM education throughout all of our schools. We should improve coordination between the federal government and tech hubs across our country. We should work with like-minded partners across Europe and the Indo-Pacific to regain a competitive edge and lead efforts to form an international technology alliance and establish the rules and regulations that will sustain an enduring open internet and set the standards for the technologies of the future. As we strive to keep the internet open and the applications of these technologies ethical, we must understand some of these industries will require a degree of government protection. That's why Congress passed reforms to close loopholes in the review of foreign investment known in the United States as CFIUS. As CSIS think tank scholar James Lewis and others have pointed out, U.S. technological leadership has flourished by embracing openness. But this openness cannot be so laissez-faire and unguided as to ultimately lead to our demise. I recommend notionally building a high fence around a small yard of our most critical and sensitive technologies. But as we safeguard these crown jewels of technology, we also have to strike the right balance to avoid a situation where there is a decoupling of global tech industries between the United States and China. This brings me to my third area of competition, trade. Anyone thinking about trade today? We need to rethink our trade strategy and focus it on stopping China's intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer while acknowledging that other problematic Chinese economic behaviors, like state subsidization of key industries, are unlikely to change given the difference in our core models of governance. While President Trump's tariffs on China have effectively gotten President Xi's attention, they have also hit our vital allies across Europe, North America, and Japan. China has countered with forceful tariffs of its own, creating uncertainty and shifting global supply chains. There's ways we can and should restore our role as a global leader for open markets and free trade. We have to work with our allies to reform the WTO and enforce the rules that we helped write and establish decades ago. We also have to set the standards when it comes to international infrastructure, especially digital and communications infrastructure. I have concerns about Belt and Road finance projects that leave recipients trapped in debt or destroy the environment or undermine human rights or ignore labor and social standards. We should encourage China in a direction embraced by Xi Jinping in his opening remarks at this year's Belt and Road Conference to enforce the highest international standards and build on our administration's ongoing efforts to deploy American transaction assistance teams to train foreign governments in how best to negotiate appropriate and better terms when engaging in BRI projects. We also have to offer an alternative. As many heads of state have said to me, Belt and Road, you can criticize it, but where is your alternative? I worked hard with the Trump administration and with a bipartisan bicameral group of colleagues to pass the BUILD Act to create a modernized 21st Century Development Finance Corporation, an institution with an expanded scope and scale to provide a new tool in our toolkit and a meaningful response. I'm excited this new agency can secure up to $60 billion in U.S. private capital. While falling short of the amount of funds that China is making available through Belt and Road, this new DFC has capabilities and authorities to allow us to partner with our allies' DFCs in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and across the world. And it'll offer a clear alternative to Chinese financing and showcase projects that comply with the best international practices. The fourth and final area in which we are likely to compete with China is over values. As CFR scholar Elizabeth Economy has pointed out, under the rule of President Xi Jinping, the CCP is today using over 200 million surveillance cameras to roll out a social credit system that either punishes or rewards Chinese people for their everyday behavior. The number of foreign non-governmental organizations operating in China has plummeted from roughly 7,000 to 400 in just 2 years. The CCP has not only repressed 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, but has rallied a group of illiberal states to express support for its re-education camps. China has raised doubts about whether it will respect Hong Kong's autonomy and the terms of the 1997 agreement it signed with the United Kingdom, and I think they should respect that agreement, not just in word but in deed, and the United States should support the right of peaceful protesters in Hong Kong and encourage China to do the same. We cannot underestimate the role of the United States as a beacon of hope to those around the world who seek to follow a more open and democratic path. I believe we have a profound interest in preserving democratic space in societies around the world. We can do this by promoting standards of good governance, transparency, press freedom, and universal values in our conduct at home, as well as in multilateral settings at the United Nations and abroad. Instead of viewing the UN as a burden that somehow infringes on our sovereignty, the United States should reconsider its engagement as an opportunity to display American leadership. There's areas where we can and should collaborate with China at the UN, in the fight against climate change, or in the vital work against Ebola, in addressing nuclear non-proliferation, or in UN peacekeeping missions. The first time I met a Chinese flag-ranking officer was in visiting a UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. But we need to clearly define our interests in using the UN to preserve the values espoused not just in our own foundational documents, but in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since the Trump administration has withdrawn from UNESCO and the UN Human Rights Council, China has filled that void, calling itself now the champion of multilateralism. And within the Human Rights Council, China advocates for each country to choose its own model of human rights protection in the context of its own national circumstances. This is a basic disagreement. I believe in the universality and desirability of our democratic system, and I think we need to remain true to our values here at home, and in doing so, demonstrate the system's strengths, the ways in which democratic government can produce strong and better results for its people. Elected officials should not attack or criticize the legitimate reporting of the free press. They shouldn't vilify dedicated career public servants. Instead, we need to roll up our sleeves and demonstrate democracy works by delivering bipartisan solutions on education, infrastructure, healthcare. We shouldn't be afraid to address our deficit, which is on an unsustainable path and represents a national security threat in and of itself. We have to be honest with ourselves about our own shortcomings in both domestic and foreign policy, and then address them in a sustainable and bipartisan manner. In conclusion, I'm glad there wasn't a round of applause. In conclusion, we should use all the tools of U.S. diplomacy, capability, and influence to keep the world free and open and inclusive. Our strategy for dealing with China has to be more sophisticated than simply saying BRI's a debt trap diplomacy and China's treatment of the Uyghurs is bad. China's theft of intellectual property is wrong. We must have a more complex, broad, and deep strategy with regards to China. While I agree with these three concerns, sentiment is not a strategy. It's an attitude. And I'm concerned it is an attitude based on fear and a sense of our own insecurity. It is unrealistic. It is profoundly unrealistic To think that merely repeating our view of why we don't like China's behavior will somehow cause China to change. Xi Jinping and the CCP are redoubling their dedication to their core model. And they believe they have a legitimate case to make to the rest of the world that their model of development works better. So frankly, I think we should exercise some humility and be realistic about our prospects of changing the CCP. Today, I've tried to lay out an alternative approach, to be vigilant and clear-eyed about what China is doing, to express our disagreements with them frankly, but to not allow that to be our sole focus. We have to articulate and demonstrate why our ideas, our standards, and international practices are better for all nations. We need to approach our role in this century with confidence in the American way, in our model that reflects the dignity of the individual, promotes freedom of navigation, fosters economic openness, innovation, and competition through freer and fairer trade, and a model that promotes the free press and free exchange of ideas across an open internet. That's our alternative to a world based on authoritarian surveillance. That's the American model. And if we're to reassert and reclaim our role as the leader of free and open societies that share our values, we have to be true to who we say we are and show the rest of the world our model works. Government, by consent of the governed, can be remarkably messy, but it is still the best form of government in the world at advancing peace, prosperity, and security, and addressing the legitimate needs of its citizens. We have to set that example right here at home. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh. If just housekeeping interruption, that was a tour de force, but I've asked Chris how long he can stay, and Hugh, I'm asking you this too. I can stay until 1:10, and and I may bail on you, my apologies, but I just, let me turn this over to Hugh, but let me just make one comment, which is, if more members of the United States Congress had the sophistication on issues that you do in both parties, we would be in a much better place. So thank you very much for that careful speech.
I'll take the first question. It's great to be with Senator Coons. We met where all conservative journalists meet, Democratic senators in the Acela Lounge at Penn Station. And I want a picture of me with both of the reasonable Democrats in Washington, D.C. I'd like that. They're both. I said both. I said both.
Let's take it.
My first question goes to your first statement. We have the Dean of Harvard Law School over here. So I'm going to quote the Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, Graham Allison. If you don't want a Cold War, prepare for a Cold War. You began by saying you didn't believe we were in a Cold War. Aren't we better off if we were to prepare for one, even though you don't think we were in one, and that would mean an NDAA and an increasing defense budget and the defense transition you talked about, but all of the above?
I think that a casual talk about we are inevitably headed into a Cold War is a mistake. But being unprepared or ill-prepared for the possibility of conflict is an equally grave mistake. So two things. In the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, our economies and our technological systems were discrete and distinct. We are in a profoundly different place with China today, first. Second, we were, I think, ultimately successful in the Cold War because we led a global alliance of countries that had similar values and priorities. I am gravely concerned that we have weakened our standing as the nation best able to articulate and show the benefits of open societies and democratic governance. And so if I had a central message around this, it was not, let's not prepare. It was, let's first be clear-eyed that the weakness of the current practice of our own democracy in the capital in which I serve is one of our greatest strategic weaknesses, and we should address that.
Just to follow on this, Hugh, Chris made a huge point about the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA, and the need to retool, rethink our defense budget. I think most people here would agree with that, Certainly, we're not fighting wars anymore with our vests on, firing muskets across a field. The way we fight wars with technology is totally different, and I would say we're underprepared as someone who has studied this. And that is a step toward being ready in the event that this thing goes south. So I just have one question, Chris, and it's on the other thing you talked about, which is the rise of technology and 5G and so forth. Some people have written about the fact that we are behind on 5G, behind China, and we may end up in a situation where we basically have two different 5G systems, theirs and ours. And ours will be weaker, and ours will be more vulnerable than theirs. Do you see this, and do you think that Congress is doing anything to either legislate or at least consider what some better options are?
I don't see that as the inevitable outcome, but it is a possible outcome. There are relatively few options for the manufacture and deployment of affordable, high-quality, Western-sourced physical systems for 5G. And having met with folks from all three of the major manufacturers and purveyors from South Korea and from the Scandinavian countries.
None of which is a U.S. manufacturer.
None of which is U.S.-based. But we shouldn't overprivilege the physical networks, because an awful lot of what is going to make 5G is software that's going to sit on those physical networks, and it's important to recognize our significant competitive advantage in developing cutting-edge software. I worry when I have conversations about 5G, and it is a conversation that is really about the United States and deployment within the United States. We will certainly be successful in deployment within the United States, and it will be rapid, and it will be successful. It's the developing world that I'm most focused on. I've spent, as you know, a lot of time in Africa. There are dozens and dozens of countries that already have a built-out 4G backbone that will be extremely expensive and difficult to replace with a Western-sourced 5G backbone. And this raises basic technological questions. What is it we're seeking? What is it we're trying to do? And how do we establish standards for 5G that are sustainably promoting openness? I think there's a lot more we should be doing governmentally to advance that.
Let me go from the concern about underreaction to the worry about overreaction. In past competitions with the Soviets, we ended up making civil liberties a casualty of that, with a Red Scare in the 20s and McCarthyism in the 50s. Now we have a concern over, a legitimate concern over the PRC's intelligence operations in the United States, which adversely impacts our Chinese-American fellow citizens and visa. What do you do to both combat the PRC, and by the way, it's legitimate for a nation state to try and do that, we do it, their efforts in the United States with the concern that Chinese-Americans might feel as though they're being targeted?
That's a great question, Hugh. And there's about 350,000 Chinese nationals who are students at American universities. They play an absolutely central role in our advanced research. They make enormous contributions to our universities. They are great participants in what makes our university system the world's leading system of research and scholarship and work. But I'm struck at how many university leaders I've met with were either ill-informed about or frankly oblivious to some of the challenges around clarifying what are appropriate and what are inappropriate behaviors, what are secure and what are risky behaviors in terms of research and who has what access to what information. There have been, as you know, tragic instances of overreach, arguably even of racial profiling, and of now widely publicized ill-considered prosecutions that have significantly harmed relationships and standing of Chinese-American researchers in this country. This requires subtlety. It requires communication across the silos of our intelligence community and our academic community, which often are not closely aligned or even communicating. And it requires some subtlety and some forbearance on the part of our counterintelligence efforts to really be careful and to make certain that they are making cases where they make them that are very well-founded, because the secondary consequences of prosecutions that are not well-founded are significant. I'm grateful you cite two previous times in our history where civil liberties went out the window. We have to be careful not to do that here. The first Senate campaign on which I worked, on which I worked was for our lieutenant governor, who happened to be born in China, became a Chinese American, and was a physics professor. And he's made me quite aware of the ways in which this is harming both academic freedom, our engagement country to country, people to people, and the careers and reputations of Chinese Americans.
I think I'll pass and give the audience more time.
Okay, that's great. Always give the court more time. Who has a question? Wait, let me start back here. Go ahead.
Please identify yourself. Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all very much. This is shared with Epoch Times. Just on Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. So this question for Senator, do you think it can be passed in the Senate?
Was your question, will the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act pass the Senate? I have learned not to predict what will actually pass the Senate, because when I'm told on Thursday, even by the majority leader, oh, this is right, sometimes you never know. Likely. It has just passed the House by voice vote, Tom. How recently? Tuesday. It has passed the Foreign Relations Committee. I think the odds that it will pass the Senate by an overwhelming vote are very high, and I think it will pass soon. But that prediction was free and worth everything you paid for it. So,
Thank you. Let me go way to the end of this room over here. Is there someone down there? I want to make sure I don't excuse. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank you for saying that the U.S. should take back our leadership, and especially with the international law, the world order for the last 70 years, which led us till today. So thank you for that. I would like to ask your pragmatic view regarding the South China Sea, the situation of Southeast Asian Sea, and in particular the Vietnam relationship between U.S. and China. You did mention
That's
that.
great. Let's leave it there so we use
I
enough
want to
time.
ask about the COC, because you made a particular point saying that the U.S.-China should discuss the COC that is beyond the China and ASEAN COC. I would like to ask you to explain that too. Thank you.
Right, I assumed you were talking about code of conduct. So, the South China Sea is a fraught area for geopolitical tensions, where I think we have let too much time pass and too much activity happen without a clear and more forceful American engagement and response. The last visit I had the honor of making to Vietnam was with Senator McCain, and I think there is a very strong potential for our relationship helping define what will be the future of the South China Sea. A code of conduct, as I was talking about it, is simply a way to make clearer what are our expectations, what are the moments when, how do we avoid conflict, how do we manage competing expectations about operations, and how do we come up with a path forward in terms of accessing the resources of the South China Sea with an eye towards keeping them open and accessible. Without engaging the international legal framework of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and without actively engaging and supporting our regional partners and allies, I'm concerned that the moment for freedom of navigation and openness will pass. It is dangerously close to having done so now.
I'm going to inject a question, because when Congresswoman Harman and Rob Litwack, who's taken her place on your left, and I put this together, we didn't expect that the NBA would be at the center of the week's controversy, or that LeBron James would dominate the Nixon forum. What is your advice to the commissioner of the NBA and those who compete in the league about their statements about this, and whether or not to be silent or to speak up, and how to speak up?
A great question to which I don't have a great answer. I'll tell you that it was a striking development that a relatively minor communication has produced such a strong pushback and now sort of moment. Professional sports has on many occasions over decades provided moments or opportunities of protest or engagement here in the United States. I think it is just 51 years since a protest by two U.S. track stars at the Mexico City Olympics that drew a great deal of attention. So this certainly isn't the first time that professional sports, whether football or basketball, has drawn attention. I am concerned that this shows the ways in which the economic relationship between the United States and China has privileged a values conversation. The United States has to be a society that stands for peaceful protest and for democratic values. And while I respect the fact that U.S. headquartered companies are not exclusively American companies, they have global interests, this is showing more pointedly and in more a real way to the average American that just because this is a local basketball team that you think of as an American basketball team doesn't mean that the business of basketball is restricted to the United States and doesn't have other priorities. That's true of Hollywood, it's true of Silicon Valley, it's true of our manufacturing companies, it's true of our service companies. As our companies increasingly have as much of a footprint in China in terms of their current and future growth as they do elsewhere in the world, they've come into conflict between our values and China's values. My hope is that in this case, the NBA will speak up on behalf of peaceful protest, but I'm not optimistic about it. And I do think it should cause a wide range of Americans to think about what do we expect of our institutions? If we are cheering for and buying the gear of and supporting a particular sports franchise, do we expect them to take a position that is fundamentally American, or do we really not care? Is it really not our business what they do in the rest of the world? That's a basic challenge that we need to sort out. And since I'm from Delaware, the home of more American corporations than any other state in the country, I'll tell you this is a conversation that the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce and others are beginning to have about what are the obligations of business. In Delaware's courts, it is shareholder value. But there are corporate leaders who are beginning to say perhaps we should have a definition of corporate responsibility that is a notch broader. And I think there is the unexamined expectation on the part of most American fans that sports franchises are American, and this is a wake-up call that no, they're not. They're global businesses that are trying to generate revenue. And the Chinese market for basketball fans and basketball viewership is enormous and very attractive. And so this should be the moment, I think, a moment that precipitates a conversation. When we have a values conflict with China, how does that impact our economic interaction? And to the American consumer and voter, what is it that you expect of name brands? As you may know, I was in-house counsel for a global brand 20 years ago. And most Americans think of it as an American-invented, American-headquartered, American-operating company, but it's a truly global company that had as many operations in China and in Europe as it did in the United States. And we had conversations around the C-suite about exactly this issue that today, because of this example, is now made more present and more real, but it is an unresolved issue. What are our expectations of corporate conduct, and what, if any, action should we take governmentally or societally to say you're not a global company, you're an American company?
One more question? All right.
Thank you for coming, Senator. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. Can you comment on the negotiation with North Korea up to this point?
Can I comment on the negotiations with North Korea up to this point? I appreciate the brevity and yet challenge embedded in that question. Look, I try to give credit where possible to our president. He certainly took a bold step in agreeing to meet in person with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. And he accomplished in their first summit something that for the families of our war dead from the Korean conflict is significant. But it was a framework that was paper thin and has not produced any significant progress. The tensions between Japan and South Korea, the challenges between the United States and North Korea, the regional challenges, I think, are significant and, if anything, have become more pressing. With the recent deployment of a submarine-launched missile and the resumption of missile tests and the likely resumption of nuclear enrichment and weapons production activity, the almost certain continued practice of that. This is, in many ways, the most pressing national security challenge we have. And I don't think that high-stakes photo-op diplomacy between two leaders that aren't well prepared by pre-negotiations that bring in regional players are likely to be successful. This is essentially a regional and global non-proliferation problem. I think there is the possibility of a good deal with North Korea, but walking away from the JCPOA and its structure for searching inspections, for transparency, and it was a flawed deal that did not have the sort of the end of the box was not drawn in, don't get me wrong, but it was the best reasonable approximation of what a deal looked like that allowed a country to rejoin the world of nations and to engage in open commerce. And my concern is that by tearing that up, we send a clear and strong signal that any deal reached between the United States and North Korea is not a reliable longer-term deal, A. B, Libya continues, I think, to be a haunting challenge for those of us who would like to see a number of things in our future. And if I were advising Kim Jong-un, how's that for a sentence? Hard to put oneself in those shoes. Why would he choose to give up nuclear weapons if Gaddafi's outcome has been less than desirable from Gaddafi's perspective? Or if Ukraine, which gave up their nuclear weapons based on a signed agreement between the United States and Russia, is today a smaller nation as a result and durably under assault by Russian-backed separatists. You've got two examples in recent history of a country that literally gave up nuclear weapons programs, and the outcomes are tragic for both. I'm sorry, there's a third, South Africa, where the outcome, I think, is generally positive. But so I worry about the lack of current examples, and I worry that this is a critical challenge or irritant in the U.S.-China relationship and in the regional relationship. I will remain prayerfully hopeful that our president is successful in these negotiations, but so far I think they have been fundamentally flawed in the way in which he's approached them.
Please join me in thanking Senator Coons for joining us.